40 years of grace, the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, painting soft streaks of gold across the room. Miriam sat in silence at the edge of her bed, holding a steaming cup of tea. The world was still asleep, but she was awake, fully present, fully alive, feeling the weight and the beauty of this quiet moment. Today was her 40th birthday, a day she had long anticipated with a mixture of dread and awe. There was something sacred about this milestone. 40 years. A lifetime, in many ways. Miriam had weathered storms and seen sunsets that seemed to last forever, each moment both fleeting and eternal. It felt surreal to think of everything that had brought her to this point, the memories of triumphs and failures, laughter and tears, love and loss. She had lived a lifetime in these 40 years, some moments filled with joy and hope, others marked by pain and despair so deep that she thought she might never recover. But here she was, alive, standing tall, a survivor of storms that would have crushed even the strongest of souls. The woman who sat there now was different from the one who had started this journey. Her body had changed, yes, but it was the change within that had truly defined her. The steam from her tea mingled with the soft glow of the morning light, and for the first time in a long while, Miriam felt at peace. Peace wasn't something she had always known. It was something she had fought for, something she had prayed for. But today, on her 40th birthday, it enveloped her like a gentle, warm blanket. Her childhood had been modest yet beautiful. Her father, a school teacher, and her mother, a nurse, were people of quiet dignity. Though they didn't have much, they believed in providing the best they could for their children. Miriam and her siblings never went to bed hungry, never lacked a warm home, and always had the gift of education. Education is your inheritance, her father would often say. And dignity, my dear, is wealth that no one can take from you. These values had been the foundation of her life. Her father's wisdom and her mother's quiet strength were the compass points that guided her through her youth. She excelled in school, and when she entered university, her parents were proud. It was there, in the bustling halls of academia, that she met Daniel, the illusion of forever. When Miriam first met Daniel at university, it felt as though the world had been waiting for them to find each other. She was 21, full of hope and ambition, while Daniel, a final-year engineering student, exuded confidence and charm. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. He pursued her relentlessly, leaving little love notes in her textbooks, showing up at her favorite cafe, and offering to walk her to the library after evening lectures. Miriam found herself swept up in the whirlwind of his attention. He made her feel seen, adored, and understood in ways she never had before. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever met," he'd whisper as they sat under the jacaranda trees on campus. He spoke of their future with certainty, a big house, children, success, and a love that would withstand anything. Miriam, though cautious, couldn't help but be drawn in. She was already a mother to a little girl from a relationship that ended before it could truly begin. Her daughter, Leah, was her world, and she worried about how Daniel might feel about stepping into the role of a father, but Daniel brushed her concerns aside. "Leah is part of you," he said one evening, holding her hand. "I'll love her as my own. You'll see." By the time Daniel graduated, their bond felt unshakable. They moved in together shortly after, not out of convenience but out of a mutual conviction that they were meant to be. There was no grand wedding, no formal vows exchanged, but their love felt sacred. Miriam believed that what they had was real, permanent, and unbreakable. For a time, it was. Daniel secured a good job and encouraged Miriam to stay home and focus on Leah. He was a doting partner, often bringing home small gifts and cooking with her on weekends. They spent long nights talking about their dreams, their laughter echoing through their small apartment. Miriam dared to believe she had found the love of her life when she gave birth to their first child together, a son they named Caleb. Miriam was convinced her life was complete. She imagined a future filled with family vacations, shared milestones, and growing old with the man she loved. But life had other plans. The change was subtle at first. almost imperceptible. After Caleb was born, Daniel's mother, Veronica, began visiting more frequently. She would hold the baby, coo over him, and then cast a critical eye toward Miriam. "You're not feeding him enough," she'd say, clicking her tongue. "He's too thin. When I had Daniel, he was twice this size." Miriam bit her tongue out of respect, unwilling to cause a scene. But as the weeks turned into months, Veronica's comments grew sharper. She criticized Miriam's cooking, her housekeeping, even the way she dressed. One evening, after Veronica had left, Miriam turned to Daniel. "Your mother doesn't seem to like me much," she said carefully. "She just wants the best for us," Daniel replied, his tone dismissive. "Don't take it personally." But it was personal. Over time, Veronica's disapproval turned into outright hostility. She began accusing Miriam of being lazy, ungrateful, and undeserving of her son. "She's not good enough for you," Veronica said one afternoon when she thought Miriam wasn't within earshot. Miriam expected Daniel to defend her, to remind his mother that she was the woman he loved, the mother of his children. But instead, he said nothing. That silence marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship, one defined by distance, resentment, and cruelty. At first, Daniel's criticisms mirrored his mother's. He began nitpicking everything Miriam did, from the way she folded the laundry to how she spoke to the children. But soon, his words turned venomous. "You're nothing without me," he spat one evening after an argument. "If it weren't for me, you'd still be struggling to make ends meet." Miriam was stunned. The man who once promised to love and cherish her now seemed intent on breaking her spirit. The emotional abuse escalated quickly. Daniel began controlling every aspect of her life, her friends, her finances, her freedom. He gave her just enough money to cover the basics, always reminding her that she contributed nothing. When Miriam expressed a desire to work, to have something of her own, Daniel's response was swift and brutal. "You want to leave the house," he sneered. "Go ahead. But don't expect to come back." She didn't believe him until it happened. One evening, after a long day at her new job, Miriam came home to find the door locked. Daniel refused to let her in, claiming she had abandoned her duties as a wife and mother. Humiliated and defeated, Miriam quit her job the next day. Her days became a monotonous routine of cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children, all while enduring Daniel's insults and Veronica's meddling. She felt trapped, suffocated by the life she once dreamed of. Her once vibrant spirit was crushed under the weight of constant criticism. She stopped smiling, stopped dreaming. Even her love for her children couldn't erase the growing void inside her, but through it all, she endured. She endured because she believed in the sanctity of marriage, because she wanted her children to grow up with both parents, and because she didn't know how to leave. Miriam thought she had no choice but to stay. But deep down, a part of her still hoped for something better. A shell of herself, Miriam sat on the edge of her bed, the soft hum of the ceiling fan barely breaking the silence of the house. The mirror across the room reflected a woman she barely recognized, hollow eyes rimmed with exhaustion, hair that had lost its shine, and shoulders perpetually slumped under the invisible weight she carried. This wasn't the woman she once was. There was a time when Miriam's presence could light up a room. Her laughter was contagious, a melodic reminder of her joy and confidence. She was the kind of woman who faced challenges head-on, who believed in herself and her ability to create a meaningful life. She had dreams, so many dreams. She'd once imagined opening her own business, mentoring young women, traveling to places she'd only read about in books, but those dreams now felt like artifacts of a forgotten past, buried under years of emotional and psychological abuse. The cracks in her spirit had started small. At first, it was Daniel's disapproving looks, the subtle jabs about her cooking or parenting. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, that all couples had their disagreements. But then the criticisms became relentless. "You're useless," Daniel would mutter as he brushed past her in the kitchen. "You think you're so smart, but look at you, what have you accomplished?" He'd sneer when she tried to express her opinions. Each word chipped away at her confidence, like water eroding a stone. even worse were the financial constraints. Daniel controlled every penny, doling out just enough money for groceries and household necessities. If she asked for anything beyond that, a new pair of shoes for the children, a school trip fee, she'd be met with the disdain. "What do you think I am, a bank?" he'd scoff. The humiliation stung, but what hurt more was the slow realization that she had no autonomy. She couldn't make decisions for herself or her children without his approval. Her attempts to regain some semblance of independence were met with cruelty. When she got a job at a local office, she felt a flicker of hope, a small step toward reclaiming her identity. But Daniel snuffed it out quickly. "You're abandoning your children for strangers," he accused one evening, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a disgrace." The night he locked her out of the house was the final blow. Standing on the porch, her children crying inside, Miriam felt the weight of her helplessness. The shame was unbearable. The next day, she handed in her resignation. From that moment on, she stopped trying. She told herself it was easier to go along with Daniel's demands, to avoid confrontation, to keep the peace for the sake of her children, but the cost was steep. Her world became smaller and smaller. Friends stopped calling when she could never meet up. Family visits grew infrequent, as she felt too ashamed to explain why she couldn't host them or why she always seemed on edge. The isolation was suffocating. The woman who once thrived on connection and community now spent her days in silence, her only companions the walls of her home and the endless to-do lists dictated by Daniel's whims. Her health began to decline. Migraines became a constant companion, her body manifesting the stress she couldn't voice. She lost weight, not because she wanted to, but because she often forgot to eat. Even her faith, which had always been a source of strength, felt distant. She would kneel to pray, words tumbling out in a desperate whisper, but it felt like her pleas evaporated into the air, unheard and unanswered. One day, as she stood in front of the mirror, holding a comb in her hand, she realized she hadn't smiled in weeks. Her reflection stared back at her, unrecognizable. Her once bright eyes were dull, her skin pale, her expression void of any spark. "I don't know who I am anymore," she murmured to herself, the words heavy with resignation. Her children were the only reason she kept going. When they smiled, it reminded her of the life she wanted for them, a life filled with love, stability, and opportunities. But even they began to notice the change in her. "Mommy, why are you sad?" Leah asked one evening, her small voice piercing through Miriam's carefully constructed facade. Miriam didn't have an answer. She didn't even have the strength to pretend. For years, she moved through life like a ghost, her vibrant personality replaced by a quiet, obedient shadow of her former self. She stopped dreaming. She stopped hoping. She simply existed, but deep within her, buried under layers of pain and despair, a tiny ember still burned. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a small, stubborn part of her that refused to be extinguished. It was that ember that would eventually lead her to rediscover herself, to rebuild her life, and to find her way back to the woman she was always meant to be. But for now, she was a shell, a hollow reminder of the person she once was, holding on by the thinnest of threads, rediscovering herself. Miriam's journey toward rediscovery began not with a grand revelation but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. It started with a simple email, a job listing forwarded by a former colleague she hadn't spoken to in years. "Remote work opportunity. Thought of you," the email read. At first, Miriam dismissed it. She hadn't worked in years, hadn't touched her degree or skills since Leah was a toddler. What could she possibly offer in today's job market? But late that night, as the house settled into its usual tense silence, she found herself opening her laptop. Her fingers trembled as she updated her resume. It was outdated, sparse, and lacked the confidence she once carried. She paused, staring at the empty skills section. What did she even know anymore? But then, she remembered the years spent managing her household, navigating Daniel's moods, and multitasking with the children. She realized that resilience, time management, and problem-solving had become second nature. "This is a start," she whispered, clicking save. The job application process was grueling, each rejection a blow to her fragile self-esteem. But Miriam kept at it, fueled by something she hadn't felt in years, a faint flicker of hope. She began watching free online tutorials during her children's nap times, relearning basic computer skills, and exploring industries that embraced remote work. Finally, after weeks of searching, she received an email with the subject line, "Welcome to the team." She'd been hired as a remote customer support agent. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. At first, balancing work and home life felt impossible. Daniel scoffed at her efforts, dismissing her new job as a hobby. Veronica, ever critical, accused her of neglecting the children. But Miriam pushed forward, waking up early and staying up late to complete her tasks. Her first paycheck was a revelation. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she didn't have to ask Daniel for money. She used a small portion of it to buy something she hadn't had in years, a journal. Each night, she wrote down her thoughts, pouring her feelings onto the pages. At first, the words were heavy with anger, frustration, and grief. But as the weeks passed, her entries began to change. She wrote about her small victories at work, about the joy of spending her own money on small treats for the children, and about the sense of purpose she was beginning to rediscover. Reclaiming her identity with time, Miriam's confidence grew. She began exploring other opportunities, taking on freelance work that paid better and allowed her to flex her creative muscles. She learned about digital marketing, remote team management, and virtual assistants. Slowly, she began to see herself not just as a mother and a wife, but as an individual with skills, dreams, and aspirations. Her home life began to shift as well. Daniel, perhaps sensing her newfound strength, grew quieter. The insults became less frequent, the control less rigid. It was as though her independence made him reevaluate the power dynamics in their relationship, but Miriam didn't let herself become complacent. She knew her self-worth couldn't depend on Daniel's approval or anyone else's. She set boundaries, gently but firmly refusing to engage in arguments or tolerate disrespect. She also started prioritizing her well-being. For the first time in years, she went to a salon and had her hair done. She bought herself a new dress, not for Daniel, but for herself. When she looked in the mirror that evening, she saw a glimpse of the woman she used to be, but stronger, wiser, and more determined. Her relationship with her children deepened as well. They saw her working, succeeding, and standing up for herself. Leah, now a teenager, began asking her mother for advice about life and goals. "Mom, you're amazing," Leah said one evening as they sat together. "You've shown me what strength looks like." Those words brought tears to Miriam's eyes. For so long, she had felt like a failure, but hearing that from her daughter reminded her of the legacy she was building, a legacy of resilience, courage, and faith. A deepened faith. Amid her rediscovery, Miriam's relationship with God also took on a new dimension. She began waking up early to spend quiet moments in prayer and reading the Bible. Verses about restoration and renewal resonated deeply with her. Isaiah 61:3 became her anchor, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Miriam realized that God had been with her through every moment of pain and despair, even when she couldn't feel His presence. Her prayers shifted from pleas for escape to expressions of gratitude and hope. One morning, as she journaled, she wrote, "I am no longer defined by what I've endured. I am defined by what God is doing in me and through me." The beginning of something new. By the time Miriam turned 40, she was no longer the shell of herself she once was. She was a woman rebuilt, layer by layer, step by step. Her remote work had grown into a thriving business, allowing her to provide for her children without relying solely on Daniel. On the morning of her birthday, she woke up to the sound of her children singing in the kitchen. They had made her breakfast, pancakes and fresh fruit, and presented her with a handmade card that read, Thank you for being the best mom and showing us what true strength looks like." As she sat at the table, surrounded by her children's laughter and love, Miriam felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had come so far, not just surviving but thriving. Renewed faith. Miriam's faith had always been her anchor, even in the darkest of times. But during the years of abuse and struggle, she had often prayed with desperation rather than hope, feeling as though her cries fell into silence. Now, as she reflected on her journey, she saw God's hand in every step. He had given her strength when she thought she had none, wisdom to navigate challenges, and opportunities to rise when she had been knocked down. Her prayer life transformed. No longer filled with pleas for survival, her prayers became expressions of gratitude and trust. She began journaling her spiritual reflections, jotting down verses that resonated with her and writing out the lessons she had learned along the way. She also became more involved in her church community, joining a women's group where she found support and camaraderie. These women, many of whom had faced their own struggles, became a source of inspiration and encouragement. Together, they shared stories of perseverance and faith, reminding Miriam that she was never alone in her journey. Reimagining her dreams, turning 40 also reignited the dreams Miriam had once abandoned. As a young woman, she had dreamed of starting her own business, of building something meaningful that could leave a legacy for her children. For years, those aspirations had been overshadowed by survival, but now, they felt possible again. With the skills she had honed through remote work, she began planning her next big step, launching her own virtual services business. She envisioned a platform where she could not only earn a living but also help other women like herself, women who needed a chance to rebuild their lives. She worked late into the night, researching and sketching out her ideas. It wasn't easy balancing this new venture with her responsibilities, but Miriam thrived on the challenge. When she finally launched her small business, she was met with overwhelming support. Her first clients came from word-of-mouth recommendations, and soon she had a steady stream of projects. She named her business A Renewed Horizons, a nod to her journey and the brighter future she now envisioned. Peace in the home. The changes in Miriam extended to her marriage as well. Daniel, who had once been the source of so much pain, seemed to notice the transformation in his wife. She no longer sought his approval or feared his anger. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Though their relationship was far from perfect, the hostility had diminished. There were moments of tenderness now, moments where Daniel would ask about her work or sit down to have a genuine conversation. Miriam couldn't say whether he had truly changed or whether her strength had simply forced him to reevaluate his behavior. Either way, she no longer lived in constant fear. Their home was no longer a battlefield but a place of tentative peace, where love and laughter had begun to seep back in. A heart of gratitude. On the morning of her 40th birthday, Miriam woke up early. The house was quiet, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, her journal open on her lap.as. She looked back on the past decade. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain she had endured, but for the strength she had found in its aftermath. She had been battered and bruised but never defeated. Her children surprised her later that morning with handmade cards and a small cake. "We wanted to make your day special," Aliyah said, hugging her tightly. "It already is," Miriam replied, her voice thick with emotion. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Miriam raised her glass. "To new beginnings," as she said, her voice steady. "To the lessons we've learned and the love that carries us forward." In that moment, Miriam knew that her story was far from over. But as she stepped into this new chapter, she carried with her a sense of hope, purpose, and unshakable faith. She was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by her resilience, her courage, and the boundless possibilities of her future. 40 years of grace. The day Miriam turned 40 dawned like no other. It wasn't the gifts or the birthday cake that made it special. It wasn't even the well wishes flooding her phone or the laughter of her children that filled the house. What set this day apart was the quiet, overwhelming realization that she had lived 40 years wrapped in the undeniable grace of God. As she sat at the small dining table in her home, sipping her morning tea, she allowed herself to fully reflect on the journey she had traveled. Life had not been easy, but it had been purposeful. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to her parents who had worked tirelessly to provide her with a life of dignity. Though they didn't have wealth, they always had enough, and the foundation of faith and love they built in her heart had carried her through the storms of life. Her upbringing had taught her gratitude, and now, as she stared out at the sun rising over the horizon, she whispered, "I thank you, Lord, for everything." Miriam thought about the first half of her life and how much of it had been defined by struggle. Yet, she now saw how grace had been threaded through it all, hidden in the strength she didn't know she had, in the small miracles that had sustained her, and in the lessons that had shaped her into the woman she was becoming. A journey through pain. There had been moments when grace felt distant, when life seemed unbearably cruel. The 12 years of her marriage that tested every part of her being had nearly broken her. She had been betrayed, belittled, and bruised in ways that left her questioning her worth and her purpose, and yet, through it all, there had been whispers of God's presence, a neighbor's kind word, a sermon that seemed meant just for her, or the innocent laughter of her children that reminded her of life's beauty. Even in the depths of despair, grace had never truly abandoned her. Her healing had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But now, as she looked back, she could see how every step, every tear, and every prayer had been part of a divine plan. The celebration. Her children had insisted on throwing her a small birthday party. Leah had taken charge, decorating the living room with balloons and streamers. Her son, ever the eager helper, had baked cookies under her supervision, proudly presenting them with a big smile. Even her youngest daughter, only 7, had insisted on writing a birthday card, her handwriting wobbly but heartfelt. When Daniel walked into the room carrying a bouquet of roses and a cake, Miriam felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was still so much unspoken between them, so much that couldn't be erased by gestures alone. But there was also peace, a fragile, hopeful peace that had grown in their home over the past few years. As they sat together, singing a happy birthday year and sharing stories, Miriam realized something profound. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was full. She had her health, her children, her work, and most importantly, her faith. Lessons from the past. Turning 40 brought with it a clarity that Miriam hadn't known before. She saw her past not as a collection of failures and pain, but as a rich tapestry woven with lessons. She had learned the strength of perseverance, the power of forgiveness, and the beauty of self-love. She had discovered that true peace doesn't come from perfect circumstances, but from a heart that chooses gratitude in the face of adversity. Miriam no longer saw herself as a victim. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman of grace. The years that had once felt stolen from her were now seen as years of preparation, preparing her for a life that was more meaningful and fulfilling than she had ever imagined. Faith renewed. As the evening drew to a close, Miriam retreated to her bedroom with her Bible and journal. She opened to the Psalms, her favorite book of the Bible, and let the words wash over her. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The verse felt personal, as though God himself was speaking directly to her. She wrote in her journal, pouring out her gratitude for the grace that had carried her through 40 years. She thanked him for the hardships, for they had taught her resilience. She thanked him for the moments of joy, for they had reminded her of his goodness. She thanked him for her children, who were her greatest blessings, and for the work that had given her a renewed sense of purpose. Lord, as she wrote, I don't know what the future holds, but I trust you. Thank you for 40 years of grace. Thank you for never leaving me, even when I felt lost. Thank you for making all things new. Looking ahead, for Miriam, turning 40 wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. She felt a sense of expectancy, a quiet assurance that the years ahead would be her best yet. Her dreams, once buried under the weight of survival, were beginning to bloom again. She envisioned expanding her business, mentoring other women, and maybe even writing a book about her journey. She wanted to leave a legacy not just for her children but for every woman who felt like life had passed them by. Her past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. As she looked into the mirror that night, She saw not a broken woman but a woman who had been pieced back together by the hands of grace. Her 40th birthday wasn't just a milestone. It was a celebration of life, love, faith, and the unyielding power of hope.